Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Planning Committee. Serving with me on the committee is April Barker, excuse me, and Daniel Hamill. We're going to have a committee discussion of potential regulatory approaches and techniques to provide additional housing choice in Bellingham. Rick? No, or is it Rick or April or?
I can start. We just ended at the last committee with wanting to talk a little bit more about what policies we already had, maybe seeing if there's anything that would relate to the housing choice and social equity, a little bit about upward mobility. So these are all of the goals and policies that are related to the things that we've been talking about, I think minus the manufactured housing. And I think it's just a good time now that we've had a lot of information is kind of to come back to our guiding document, see if there's anything that bubbles up there for any of us, maybe have a conversation around some of these things, ask staff some questions, and then determine our next steps, if that's helpful.
Okay.
So I can always start. I have one question about these, Rick, unless you have anything that you'd like to say.
No, I think what we tried to do was extract from the comprehensive plan the policies that give direction on this that are already in place. And a number of the issues that have been discussed over the past 2 months are contained in that document. The question comes up, I think, about what to tackle first and how to approach it, and that really is the nature of it. We can't, we try and during our work program to implement all of the policies, but clearly it's incremental because some take much more work, take regulatory changes. Others are policy-based that don't require a change. For example, processing permits. You don't have to do an ordinance for it. It's a policy change. So I think that gives you a good handle. The key would be whether you see a need to change focus or to prioritize some steps to be considered.
For me, the big eye-opener on the manufactured and mobile home parks is how people are living in fear. And I know that there was, we talked about that before, and is there any way, I know that that's not part of your work plan or part of what the Planning Commission is doing now and everything, but that's something that I'm really concerned about because I could see a time where somebody comes in with a big, huge check, buys one of those places out, and the next thing you know, we got 1,100, 1,200 people that have to relocate. So is there anything we can do there? I know that's legal issues, and I know somebody said something that we have to take a time out on that one for a little while before we talk about that anymore, or do you have any thoughts on that, Rick?
Well, I think it's agreed that they provide an affordable housing choice. And it's certainly a fact that a number of residents live in those facilities. There are about 1,200 units, I think, throughout the city in various locations. To be fair, some of the locations have ownership of the dirt underneath them, the lots, and some do not. And we do monitor fairly closely on how that works. State law does, as you heard at your last meeting, provide the ability for the tenants to acquire the parcel, and it also provides for a notice period in terms of separation. While we think at this point in time, we think it's an issue that bears attention, we have not seen substantial interest for redevelopment at this time.
Okay.
And that's really key as we go to prioritize work going forward. So at this point, we're getting materials, we're looking more closely. We'd like to get back to you at your next Planning Committee meeting and discuss it more fully. But we really should take a look at each of the different locations and see what the status is, review inquiries to the department, and give you a full update. And at that point, we can probably tell you some options to consider on how to proceed.
Okay, that's good. Dan?
I just want to expand on I do share the chair's concern in regards to that form of non-subsidized, I would regard affordable housing. We had talked a little bit, and I believe it was the last meeting, or perhaps the meeting before, about could there be a possibility for the housing levy dollars to be a source of revenue to come in and secure that land should that land be sold for some other use. I would want to expand on that discussion to make sure that we at least vet that concept and that idea. I was able to speak with Culshan Community Land Trust Executive Director after that meeting, and he was pleased that that was brought up as an item. They could be an operator of that or in that function should that arise. But I would want to make sure that we have housing dollars that could be set aside to protect those homes. So I don't know if that's something that can come out of the current levy, or if those dollars are dedicated and already spent, or if that's something that could come out of the next levy. But I would want the city to be poised and be in a position to be able to save that housing type.
If I might respond, a number of jurisdictions across the state have done just that. They've stepped in to preserve the option and the investment that the property owners or the homeowners have placed in it. I think at this point, let us review some approaches on how that could be used. It's hard when we don't have a certainty that one would exchange, but we need to have a reserve perhaps that could accommodate that should something come up. Again, we're not aware of significant redevelopment plans that at this point, but again, I want to do my detailed due diligence and get back to you in 2 weeks.
Okay, that's fine. April?
All right, and so it sounds like our next committee meeting will be really looking into that issue. Thank you for your staff for helping us kind of get all together these policies. It's interesting. I learned this in my first year was that comp plan update, and how sometimes we say things that are very aligned in different parts, and then sometimes we say things that contradict each other, and I could see that in here. I think that for me, on page 12, the policy H25, monitor the city's housing affordability market, include housing demand by housing types across all income levels and in all neighborhoods, and report on the effectiveness of the city's housing affordability policies. So when we were talking about, is there anything that bubbles up to the top where we might be able to add in a focus? This is one that I'd like to explore. It's come up several times in our consolidated work plan. So there's a joint stakeholder committee with the mayor, Dan and I representing the council, and then a variety of stakeholders within social services and others in this meeting. And we've talked about, which we did talk about when we talked about middle housing, that there seems to be this bottleneck in our subsidized housing where people are coming in, they're getting that subsidized housing, and then actually a quote from one of the members is they're concerned that they're seeing some of the people that are in subsidized housing not taking that next level job, because it's either take the job, lose your housing, and then don't have housing, or don't take the job and stay in that subsidized housing because you don't want to leave Bellingham. And that's a real issue, and if it's coming up to that level, I think for somebody to bring that up in a committee meeting, somebody who's dealing with this all the time, I think it's crucial that we make sure that we have that next stage of housing. What is that? And then I think just also, we see some neighborhoods who have suffered the brunt of some of this. We've seen some neighborhoods who are much higher maybe in renters than they are in homeowners, or vice versa. And I don't see any document that helps us do this very thing that we said, where we're going to look at affordable housing, and I think that would be the big A, affordable housing subsidized, the little a. And to help us, I think, drive ourselves, kind of like we're doing with the equity plan for parks, whether it be a housing equity audit for ourselves to really understand what we're doing. So I just wondered, with this policy, what have you seen in other communities where, how do other municipalities effectively look at this housing affordability, see if their policies are actually working?
Well, it is a challenge because we play a role in the housing market, but we don't control the market. It's market rate. Towards that end, the things we do is to ensure that we have adequate land supply. So other communities always look to say, do we have opportunities for development for types of land? And then it's our housing chapter of our comp plan provides guidance, sort of a blueprint of providing affordability. But it acknowledges that a key component of affordability is wage. We need to change our demographics, economic demographics, in terms of the kind of wages we can pay to be able to afford home ownership or even rental fees in a market that's ascending. I do think that in looking at the comp plan, it does provide some good background data on where we are in affordability. And it does, as you look through all of these policies, provide a variety of approaches. You know, the big four for us are to provide land for new development, to provide focused development in urban villages, to look for infill opportunities that are there, and then also to try to maximize development in our UGA and bring the UGA in. And that's how we would accommodate growth. We could look, as other communities have, sort of at the status and do that more frequently. And I think we have to, because we have to say, is the approach working? Are we seeing more traction for affordability for either rental or for ownership?
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're at now. We probably want to take a harder look on our strategies and say, what are the things we should elevate up, and what are the things that haven't proven to show much change, and we'd want to just kind of leave where they're at and move forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, in speaking with several constituents that live in the single-family housing zones, some of which actually allow different types, some are more restrictive and allowing only single-family detached homes, and then people who are living in the multifamily areas, especially the highly dense areas, and really trying to ask people, like, what's your next step? Like, when you're ready to go, say you started in, it wasn't your dream. Some people it is. They want to live in that more dense multifamily. For those that it's not, and it's more of an affordable housing concern, so they go into the highly dense multifamily housing. And then that question of, like, so what's your next step? Like, where are you going to go? And that, again, and I think it relates to that bottlenecking in the subsidized housing, is what the stage used to be, you would maybe get a fixer-upper, single-family detached home, and be able, but now that people are coming back into the urban sectors, that's not available for everybody. And I want every constituent to feel like there is a next step for them, that they don't have to leave Bellingham because there aren't those styles of housing that they might be able to afford for that upward mobility. And but I think that's where then we get into this rub of kind of a it's really difficult to see something that that although we have history of, say, different types of housing in all areas, we maybe we definitely don't have, how do I say this? I think we've done some poor development in the city long time back. We now have some better development that we're able to go back and show that we have the rules in place. But how do we balance in that next stage of knowing we're already fulfilling the growth management? We've shown that we have the housing at least in place. It's determined, it's up to the developers if they're going to develop that. But what else can we do in that based on this housing equity? And I think that's where the rub comes, because if the dream was always that single-family home, maybe the dream detached, the dream has changed, but then how do we make sure that that's incorporated and incorporated everywhere? And that's where it comes back to me for when we started talking about schools and that availability. So I know to the north that infill toolkit is available, and so we're seeing a lot of those middle housing types. But then we're seeing most of the families with young children moving into some of those areas, and it's overburdening one school more than another, and we're not getting that that component of different incomes going to school together. And so I guess that's where, for me, I keep coming back to this, and to me, it's clear, but I don't. That we need more housing types. In Europe, they always say a single-family home, but they either say detached or unattached because they just consider all those single-family homes. We need better language, but then we need to figure out how to go to that next step of incorporating these smaller homes that would allow somebody to move out of, say, an apartment or subsidized housing and in toward what we value, and we've heard from our constituents, home ownership. So I don't know how to get to that next step without creating a lot of disturbance and upset of what we've always commonly done. And I think that's where we have to go slow to go fast and figure out a strategy of how do we satisfy people who have already been here and they like what they have, but then the people who want to attain that, what is that step? What is that process? And are our policies allowing for that process, or are our policies restricting that upward mobility process? So how do other communities ensure that they have all of those stages all the way through, not just, well, we have multifamily housing and then we have single family housing, but like we've said in here, we honor having multiple housing forms so everybody can live together. I don't know how to get to that next step.
Well, I think we should start off with sort of our approach and look at it, and then see what's missing that could supplement it. In terms of new development, as we revise our subdivision code, and this is for greenfield development, not redevelopment in existing areas, we're working to incorporate provisions for small and smaller lots for more flexibility to be able to have a variety of house forms, to match on the exterior adjacent development, provide internal transitions to provide different choice. And that's the choice you're mentioning, to find something that could be a starting point, could also provide more affordability in terms of rental homes. And we think that'll deal with some of the new development that'll occur. In terms of the urban village has developed, while it will provide a fairly good location for rental housing, only in its transition zones was seen to provide types that would deal with family housing, in a sense. It's meant to be more of a focus in urban area that has amenities that appeals to folks earlier in their life journey, or perhaps at the end. As far as our UGAs, those types are pretty prescribed at this point. So that leaves us our infill. And in looking at infill, the comp plan is very clear. We want to preserve the character of the neighborhoods. We want to make sure that the scale is maintained and the things that we value are maintained. But the comp plan also does say to investigate opportunities to establish small-scale development. Now, we're not talking about Fairhaven-style condo developments. We're not talking about towers. We're talking about duplex and triplex and small homes and smaller lots and cottage that are scaled by their nature to better fit into those areas. And the conversation would then turn, as it has in many other cities, to saying where is the best fit for those? You know, where do they fit in and how do they work to be preserve what we value, but to provide that choice. And that's where the next steps logically, according to the comp plan, would be. Find opportunities. To date, our approach had been to make the zoning structures in place. We would await a neighborhood to express interest, like Happy Valley did with the detached ADUs, and take that opportunity to introduce those house forms. That is a fairly linear approach, and it's dependent on folks looking for that opportunity. On the other hand, we do have a crisis in terms of affordability. And maybe it is time to look more broadly and see if there are other opportunities that could be developed. Not going to be everywhere, but could be in some places.
So I think that's certainly something I want to explore more. I want to understand a little bit of the history, like when did we change? When did, I mean, I was a constituent at that time, not a council member, but when the infill toolkit was applied, where it was applied, we now know that it's being used. Where it wasn't applied, why? Have things changed? You know, we've talked about zoning as needing to morph and be responsive to the community that it's serving. And you know, it's been, gosh, 2009, almost a decade.
Almost 10 years. Yeah.
So I would like to explore that, looking at where it was applied. Did it get used or not? Why or why not? What are some of our feelings on that? And where is it not being, where was it not able to be applied? And why or why not? And then maybe a further discussion around that. I do know that there's some areas like where it was greenfield that quite a bit was used. And then there's other areas like, if I remember correctly, over by BTC in the Birchwood neighborhood, you can already have detached ADUs. You can have garden court apartments. And even the residents aren't even aware. I've had 2 residents so far calling concerned about the ADU ordinance that's coming forward. And then I was able to research their properties and find out you can actually already do that in your zone. And then why hasn't it been utilized? So that's another question. If we've applied it in some places and it's not working, well, then that might help us if we do choose to apply it in other places. We could kind of go back, see why or why not. And then I think educate ourselves and our constituents on who has what zoning where, because there is a lot of confusion, and I think that comes back to our terminology. I think we have antiquated terminology that's that we could do a better job at this city. We have multifamily and single family, and it's not working. It's not broad enough to help people understand. And when we use that language over and over, it can be very confusing because people don't understand that a single family could be single family attached, detached. It includes so many of these other housing types. So I think that could probably be a whole meeting in itself.
I would imagine a part of it, Greg could correct me if I'm wrong, because he was here when the Infield Toolkit was done. The economics back in 2009, a lot different where we're at now. The market, everything, that's why it's probably being sought out now. So, but no, that's a good subject.
Yeah, and even
have.
in that same zone, I had several that I was talking about around BTC, I had several other constituents talking about, well, we really need this and we need you to implement it. And I was like, you can already do it. And so I think sometimes people, because we lock ourselves down to that language of you're a single family zone, you're a multifamily zone, it's confusing. And as we move forward, I'd like to really develop some language that we all get really consistent at, and we can be more specific and broad when we're talking about these housing types. I think it could help bring people along too, because it can be, if you're saying multifamily and you're visioning, apartment complexes that are 5 stories high, and somebody else is saying multifamily and they're picturing the Peabody townhomes, it's not working. So I think maybe if we're going to do manufactured housing, maybe the meeting after that to kind of dig in and see if there are any strategies that we have overlooked or that we maybe weren't ripe at that time but are more ripe now. Does that seem reasonable with this group?
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, and I share the concern that you have in terms of the timing of the infill toolkit and the adoption rate around the time of economic collapse, basically.
That's what it was.
So I don't know if we're going to be comparing apples to apples with that, but it would be nice to have some data to take a look at. I guess I have more of a process question in terms of how the work that we're doing is in tandem with the work of the Planning Commission. Watched the last couple of meetings, most of the last couple of meetings. The last one went pretty late. I'm trying to understand our process, the Planning Committee's process with the Planning Commission and the Consolidated Plan update and how all those will be moved forward.
Well, council sets policy, and in setting policy, you can give priority to certain aspects of policy that you'd want to see investigated. The outcome is going to be determined through a public process. I mean, in essence, we would look for, as I'm hearing the conversation evolve, we'd look for opportunities, make recommendation to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission would hold workshops, public hearings, take comment and forward on a recommendation on changes or refinements that would then be considered before the full council. The council would hold public hearings, perhaps do a number of workshops, consider public comment, and then opine on that. And then we would go to implement. Changing zoning is not a rezone. I mean, changing land use to include some of the types we have is not a rezone, categorically. And I'll double underline that. Rezone is when you change the nature of it. Allowing a smaller home is not a rezone. It's just dealing with your bulk and dimensional requirements and lot requirements, for example. Duplexes are considered single-family housing. They're just single-family attached. It is not a rezone to include those by nature. So we would consider where they could be applied because based on the history of zoning, they're prohibited in some areas and allowed in others. And I think the opportunity here is, as most communities that are facing these kind of issues find, is providing a suite of housing choices does provide a more affordable price point and does increase the opportunities for people to live in a variety of areas. As I mentioned before, we have to be thoughtful on this because not all types fit all areas. You know, there are some that might do better than others, and that might be in the type or the location. And we really have to have the Planning Commission consider that after we do some detailed analysis.
So now the Planning Commission is on the ADU ordinance right now.
The ADU ordinance that's before the Planning Commission largely deals with some code cleanup, and it deals only with one substantive change, and that is to allow for up to 20 detached ADUs in Happy Valley at the request of the Happy Valley neighborhood. It would seem that that will track on its own means. The Planning Commission is concurrently considering the short-term rental issue, largely because there is an overlap. It would be counter to our purposes to create housing options, either through what's extant now or in the future, and have them not become housing stock, but to become rental properties. And they're wrestling with both those issues simultaneously. I think it does set the stage to go forward, and I wouldn't imagine combining it all. But I think dealing with what we have on the books right now is useful, and then coming back and if this is the priority, this would be the next thing we
I would
consider.
think that's not going to be done by the end of the year with holidays coming up and everything. So we're looking at next year for.
No shortage of strong emotion on these issues, so
And
I
on
imagine
that
we'll
too,
be
one of the
at it
things
for a
I've
while.
learned over all these years of sitting up here is public involvement and perception. And if something is perceived, and I don't care what issue it is, if it's perceived to be on a fast track and we're moving forward and we're hell bent on it, we got to slow down a little bit and just take a time out and make sure it's done. Public participation in Bellingham means a lot to a lot of people, and we just have to make sure we do that no matter what. And it sounds like we're going to go on that track. So go ahead.
I think along with that second meeting of this body, talking about housing choice and then variety and that kind of with vision of that diversity of housing and creating some upward mobility. I think we've heard loud and clear from Bellingham that that vision, that dream to support home ownership is, we value it. I mean, we value it with our housing dollars. We value it for people who might need some subsidy to attain that, and others that don't need subsidy and can attain that. I think that it would be interesting to look at those choices because, you know, unlike an ADU, even we're going to be holding that homeowner occupancy, so you'll still have the occupancy, which you already had probably because you're building an ADU, but that ADU now is going to be rented, so that's not an ownership opportunity. But something like a duplex, if somebody builds that, well, now that's actually more in line. That's providing, potentially, they could both be rented, but it's potentially allowing for now 2 on one lot or 4 on one lot, depending on if you did a quadplex. And so I think that it really aligns with that value that we've been hearing, but we need to understand what, where, and then that form-based. And I think that brings me to wondering if it's possible, I don't know if you'll have enough time in the 4 weeks, but to graphically assess existing zoning to show what current zoning does encourage and discourage. And I think that's where, when we start talking about where it is appropriate and where it's not, we'll really see it. Because we currently have zoning, so I represent the Columbia neighborhood, and neighbors are frustrated that a very large home was built where a very small home was prior, and that they don't feel like it's affordable. However, if we would have that graphically assessed on what we encourage, it's all within the rules. It fits within the rules. It just was built to the envelope, and has a front porch, and it has a front door, and you know, the parking's toward the back, so it fit everything. But then if we could take that further and say, well, if this is what we're currently encouraging, you know, what inside of that could actually happen as well? Or what are things that maybe we're encouraging and it's not necessarily what that neighborhood wants, but we're attached to that single-family detached style, so we get confused on how to move beyond it. So when I was watching, let's see, Daniel Parlor, I think I sent you an email about it. He does the missingmiddle.org or whatever. So that was one of his suggestions for cities, was to go back, and although it takes a lot of time, to graphically assess the existing zoning. And what many times you find is, because we're doing zoning and density and not form-based, that there's a lot of things that could be built that people just really won't like. And then they can see it, if things were to change, what it could look like, and that might be more palatable. Does that?
Yeah, I think you're referencing Portland did a pretty good assessment of what
Yeah.
their zoning envelope would allow, and it shows the size of buildings.
Yeah.
And then it talked about if this could be a single-family home or it could be a duplex, two homes in the same mass. Issues about traffic and others did come to the fore on that, but then you come back and saying, what's the carrying capacity? Portland said that they would have some limitations about the number that were constructed in a given area to try to address that. But, everything's unique. You have to find the best blend. So we certainly could show you what our zoning would permit in typical single-family homes. And then we could share with you that approach that Portland used to say, here's what could also go in the same envelope, and how does that affect the area?
Yeah, that would be very
Sure.
helpful.
Dan?
I think policy ED 30 gets to it, page 13 of the packet here, developer support programs that seek to provide an increased supply of workforce housing. So that would be a priority for me. There's about several, but the economics of this community are such that if you're making 80% of area median income or even 100% of area median income, today it's almost impossible to buy a house. It is impossible to buy a house at 80% of area median income or 100%, unless you go through a program like Colston Community Land Trust. And full disclosure, my wife and I are Colston CLT homeowners. I think that's a great opportunity for some families, but then it goes to the point that Councilmember Barker was making before. Although you have folks that are living in subsidized housing and can't make the next step up because they lose their housing or they would be at risk of losing their housing. So to encourage market production of 80% or 100% AMI housing would be something that I would absolutely support in whatever housing type that is that needs to remain consistent with neighborhoods. The other piece is that I feel like we're talking about half of the subject here, and what I'm getting at speaks to that workforce housing, and that is economic development in this community for jobs that pay more than I think it's $19 an hour. Some right in there is what you'd need to be able to afford to rent here. So jobs that are perhaps tech oriented or skilled. I know that in Touring Options High School, of which I'm a neighbor of in the Sunnyland neighborhood, they have CTE programs. And I don't know what that stands for. It's a technical program where students in high school can learn trades, which is something that I think we've forgotten about as a country, the value of being able to have a skill-based job like that. So encouraging economic development in that capacity. I know the mayor right now is in interviews right now with a port economic development position that's she's on that interview panel. So I'm encouraged, but I think that we need to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time when it comes to being able to implement policies that make sense as relates to housing and affordable workforce housing and the economic development piece on the other side. And that's not really the purview of this committee, but it does need to be, in my opinion, a priority for our community to get those higher paying jobs, to attract employers, not necessarily ones that turn the community upside down in terms of housing, like you see in Seattle and other communities, but ones that make sense, and to partner with the port as the economic development entity in our community to create those types of jobs.
I forgot to mention at 11:15 we'll take 15 minutes of public comment. So go ahead, April.
Well, I absolutely agree with you, Councilmember Hamel, and I think on page 9, policy LU 5 is something that I think with all of these different things, making sure that we're keeping our focus is.
Could you read that out loud?
We've said fostering neighborhoods with a balance of mixed housing prices that are compatible with the wages and incomes in the community. And what I've noticed in our community is we often will get, we do have to walk and chew gum at the same time, but we could get distracted with, especially in the housing conversation where, well, we don't have the jobs to support the housing that we already have, but we have people here that aren't able to afford the houses that are here, and we have control over that. As a council, it's really hard. I mean, we certainly can give incentives and other things and direct the mayor and work with the port to make sure that those jobs are coming, but the reality is what we currently have is not accessible to over 60% of our community. And I think it's actually higher than that with the Alice report. So if the one thing I try to always come back to is like, what can I actually influence? And a big one that we can actually influence, and it's the purview of the council, is zoning, and is looking at who currently lives here. And if we don't have the housing types that support them and be able to live in our community, how do we change to make sure that we're encouraging the housing types that already work for the people who live here? Because even if those higher paying jobs come in, we still need, well, I don't know how much a bike mechanic works, but I don't know if it's more than $19. But we need people that are going to be making those lower end wages too, to do all of those jobs that are so important for our community to be going. And I think we've all agreed that we don't want to see anybody making a certain amount has to commute in from Ferndale and all those different problems. So I think that as we have that conversation would be really important. And it comes for me to potential, which I don't know a ton about in Bellingham, and I'd like to learn more, so it might be a further meeting, but the single-use occupancy. So in going to the Whatcom Museum and learning more about housing and kind of how housing has gone in Bellingham, was able to see that was very common type in our downtowns. We had these single-use occupancy where I think we still have it in the Daylight building. You have a small apartment, it's your own, but you even share a restroom with others. And it's that opportunity. And in the newspaper articles that I was looking at, it was really, well, they called it a bachelor's. It was like the long-term bachelor that had never married, and that was what they could afford, and it kept them close to their job. I think now we would look at our society, and there's quite a few people that would say, I would love that opportunity to have something really inexpensive. I have my own place to lay my head. It's my own. I don't have to share it with other people, but it keeps me close. So I don't know currently where we allow single-use occupancy style things. It would be interesting to learn more about that, whether we have pretty broad, maybe we have broad except broad policies around it. We just don't see it being developed. If there's a need for it, how much do we already have? Is it still legal to build? All of those things.
We can follow up on that. Those kind of uses, many homeless advocates attribute the removal of the single room occupancy type units that were really working for an individual working person, didn't really have cooking facilities, but provided reasonable rent. And those were the folks in terms of that economic ladder. When they were extinguished, they couldn't transfer to any other type and became homeless. So there's a linkage on that. We do allow it. I do think that it works best in a downtown environment,
absolutely,
for a variety of reasons, for accessibility of services and also to commercial uses. But we can come back and give you an update on what would it take. What we're finding is that the market, while it will provide very small occupancies for college students and micro apartments in some areas, is not as keen as doing SROs right now. And that might be a target for something that could be a levy-funded project into the future.
Okay.
Dan?
I guess to that, along those lines, we met with a group that is building tiny homes on the Lummi reservation, and have requested to do so here. I don't think that's the silver bullet. I think that's sort of a way to potentially help ameliorate the issue to some degree, as it specifically relates to people who are unhoused, unsheltered. But that is for all intents and purposes a single room occupancy, because it's a 8 by 10 or 10 by 10. So I guess and we had talked about that group having a sponsor, a partner in the community to help with management of those units. And I think that what I heard from that group was that they did not want to build a village of tiny homes. They wanted a small amount, like a cluster of just a few, I think, for management purposes, and I think maybe just for practicality. What types of, is there a zoning change that would need to happen with that council, or how does that process work?
A couple of things on that. In terms of tiny homes, it's largely a building code change that's required at the state level, and I know things are in the works right now. Largely, they're inspected by LNI. They're considered RVs, and we have a prohibition of connecting RVs permanently to a location. You could do a manufactured home, and we're very supportive and allow that in the community with a full foundation, but RVs are different, and that change is coming forward in terms of standards. In terms of the sort of detached bedroom concept, we might consider coming forward with a modification to our exemption in certain circumstances for building permits. That's what Seattle did. Seattle, to be fair, has its own building code as opposed to adopting the state code, and we'd have a number of issues we'd probably want to consider more closely, but they make small sort of those detached bedrooms allowable. In the instance of those homes, what seems to work best from the Low Income Housing Institute in Seattle's model of tiny homes is to get a sponsor. Typically, it's a religious group that takes the responsibility for the land to provide common facilities, bathrooms, showers, cooking facilities, have sort of like detached bedrooms, but also to have those who would provide service to those who live there, and then to keep the numbers low. It's 2 or 3 on a church ground supported by the church or other institution. We'd be happy to explore that if a proposal came forward, and we think that might have a good chance to get it on the ground, to test it before it becomes out of scale, and to evaluate if it's feasible here. I will say that the Low Income Institute ones in Seattle are well run and well policed. They make their own rules, and their rules have been generally to prohibit any alcohol use or drugs. You do it, you're out. To work closely with the sponsoring organization to ensure that you need to access services if you're there, and if not, you shouldn't be there. And they've had good success. And what I liked about that program was that a number of civic organizations built the units. The Bluebills, for example, Blowing Bluebills did it, and they actually had sort of a feel about their unit. They come back and see folks who are living in it, and they've had a lot of folks cycle through. So that may be an approach, but we start modestly. We do a test, and we see if it'll catch on for us.
Yeah, I think before we go to public comment, I think we got the next 2 or 3 meetings all mapped out, if I'm hearing it right.
Yeah, I think so. I'd like to just add in one more as we're talking about what you're talking about in particular is also looking at the city's land supply, and do we have a supply of land somewhere where we might be able to encourage some different housing types, some innovative housing. And it reminded me of when Councilmember Borneman brought up the Lakeway property for the green. We used to do the clean and green there.
Clean and green, yeah.
And he
that
said
area.
if we were going to flip it over, we should look at some of this affordable housing or different types. So it would be interesting to find what are those surplus lands that we have. And of course, that would even be a further meeting. But how could we set ourselves up as a city to support different organizations, different people, if they do want to venture out and try something like that? And do we have lands currently that maybe somebody like the Colshan Land Trust or other people might want to develop those lands for permanently affordable housing? So I think along the way, I'd like to keep that in the back.
Okay, go ahead.
And just one quick technical question here before public comment. I'm trying to understand the number that the county council came up with in terms of what we would need to fit into Bellingham by 2036. I believe it was around 31,000 people. Yeah, how does annexation factor into that number? So if we take chunks of Alderwood and bring that into Bellingham, are those numbers then part of that 31,000? How does that work?
Yes, those numbers are. We have anticipated about 10% of our population in the next 20 years will be accommodated by our unincorporated urban growth area properties coming in. As we come forward, and we'll be before you within the next few months on the annexation phasing plan, if we identify an area that shouldn't proceed, generally based on their own interests, what they indicate, we'd have to reallocate that population somewhere else. Now, to be fair, in terms of our population, we have over 120% of what we really need. So we put a comfortable market factor in. So we have adequacy if some people don't wish to sell or things don't develop and things like that. It's called the market factor. And we were just before the hearings board and sustained on that. What it might be, though, is if an area is not going to come in, then we would have to reallocate that population. Now, that could be accommodated by shifting it to other existing areas, or it could be through providing enterprise opportunities in some areas, or different options. We'd have to consider it at that time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, anybody want to comment? We'll turn the good old 3-minute clock up and state your name. You don't have to state your address.
Thank you, Jean, for allowing some public comment. My name is Ann Mackey. I live in the York neighborhood. It is a confusing discussion to listen to. And I think it's because it hasn't been a fact-based discussion. It's ideas, and that's great. There's a place for that. But it's confusing because Councilmember Barker made the statement, we have all this housing that people cannot afford. And I ask, so are these houses standing empty? No, we have a housing shortage. So we have these homes that people can't afford, yet some people are living in them and can afford them. So we need to answer the question, how can they afford them? Who's living in them? And so what are the facts? And I, rather than personal assumptions about there are just so many houses that people can't afford, but they're not standing empty. So let's look at how our housing is actually, in fact, being used in Bellingham. The second issue is I really liked what Ms. Barker said about asking for a housing equity audit. That would bring some facts into the discussion. For for over a year now, many of the neighborhood folks have asked the planning department to do an audit of the existing accessory dwelling units in the city. Not an audit of what they have on record as illegal units, but an audit of actually what's on the ground. So I think that inventory or / audit is one and the same thing. And secondly, regarding that suggestion for an equity audit, we could look at what already exists in the various neighborhoods. For example, this may be news to people, but in the single-family zoned sub-area 5 of the York neighborhood where I live, that area actually has over 50 multifamily duplex, triplex, fourplex, and apartment complexes in the single-family zone. So that's a fact, and it would be great to see a map and an audit and a listing of what's really there. I think a lot of people get, very antagonistic about single-family zoning and this new catchphrase of it's exclusionary. It's even, white privileged. I've heard that and read that in a lot of the letters that have been submitted. And that's just not fact-based either. I'm concerned that when we talk about creating more opportunities for these multifamily or infill toolkit housing forms, my question is, are we talking about bulldozing the existing older homes? That is the least economically good, environmentally good thing to do.
Thank you, Ann. Anybody else? Come on down, Linda.
Linda Twitchell, soon to be of the Roosevelt neighborhood. I've been looking for 6 years for a house to retire into in Bellingham, and I will believe the median price of a home is $395,000. If you're interested in core areas, some of the practical problems that I run into, and I mentioned this in case you're considering infill opportunities, we have better rules than we used to about allowing like bump outs. You can do bay windows, but you can't do box windows. And looking at older homes, there are places where if you could do a box bump out of rather 4 feet rather than the now allowable 2 feet, you could actually create a dining room. I mean, there are some simple ways that we could make our existing housing supply a little bit more usable at least at the existing prices or close to it. So I encourage planning to keep looking into that. That's a good thing. The other thing that occurred to me is I keep looking in core neighborhoods, and many of these have interesting street widths. For instance, Nevada Street, just south of Lowe's, I was told, is an 80-foot street width. 80 feet, are we ever really going to use that for what is basically a secondary street in a residential area? And that's a multifamily zone, and the first thing that occurs to me, you drive it, you see all these big, basically setback front yards that if you drive up at night or something, nobody's using them. And I have this thing about, isn't there a friendly or useful way you could make use of some of that? Perhaps one thing to consider in some of the older neighborhoods is whether the street widths, the allowable use is still appropriate or not. At one point that may have been planned because we thought we were going to have arterials everywhere. If you're looking at options for infill or smaller homes, tiny homes, whatever, if you reconsidered some of those, perhaps it would, one, be appropriate, but two, also create a little more room on some of these lots in the event that people wanted a bigger whatever or additional unit or whatever. So thought for the day.
Thank you, Linda. Anybody else? Easy, Paul.
Paul Schisler, Community Development Planner locally. I really appreciate the series of meetings you've been having, and it sounds like you'll have an ongoing series on quite a few important things. And I'd encourage us to think, as we do our future work, on the micro level that we've been talking about a lot, but also the macro level, that there's some, if we ever aim to get to have a city where everyone can afford to live here, who is here already, the people who are here working, who cannot afford the home they're in, there's a reason why the market doesn't deliver homes that are less than market rate. People aren't going to provide homes for less than the market rate unless they're some kind of a mission-driven organization or a nonprofit organization. But the market, with all the subdivision changes and changes in what's allowable or not, it'll still deliver market rate housing, but it won't deliver less than market rate housing. And actually 40% or more of the housing needs to be less than market rate if we're going to match up with the people who live here and work here and the incomes they have, which hopefully will improve over time, and there'll be a minimum wage that actually allows you to afford a $19 an hour two-bedroom apartment, full-time $19 an hour. That was a number Dan was referring to. So if we start with an audit of some kind, and that would include inventory, but the kind of housing equity audits people are doing nowadays do more than that to try to explain and get common language, as April and other people have been saying. We need to know what we're talking about when we say homes are unaffordable, and everyone can get used to the term cost burdened, spending more than you can afford on your home. Like over 50% of all renters in the city, and over half the city is renting, so that's over 25% of all the households in the city cannot afford the rental they're renting. And so getting that to be kind of common knowledge, that we actually need some major macro solutions if we're ever going to get to 40%, or actually it's more than 40%, but if 40% of the housing was in a non-market rate, less than market rate, more affordable than what the market can deliver, then any profitable landlord it would be losing money to rent for less than market rate. So nobody does that unless they're mission driven. So 40% of the housing or more needs to be somehow owned by some entity that's not trying to maximize and drive the market rate up. Whatever the market will bear, it's actually good for the landlord to do that. So we have got some macro problems that we get to tackle together. So I'm looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Anybody else before we come on down, Andrew? Come on down, ma'am, and then we'll make you the last two.
Hi, I'm Andrew Redding. I'm the second vice chair of Whatcom County Democrats and the chair of the platform and the issues and advocacy committees. And what I want to most of all share with you today, because we're just beginning our process of looking into this, but we do want to share with you the fact that Whatcom Democrats does consider that we are in a situation of crisis in this city, and so that this is not a time for, kind of continuing in a linear way on a time when we have an exponential situation developing, that's not going to satisfy the problems. I mean, we can see that the numbers of people who are walking around homeless in this city have gone up cataclysmically in the last 5 years in this town. It's just shocking how much that's happening. It's not all happening for mental health problems anymore. It's happening in large measure because a lot of people are dropping out of the bottom of the market on rentals. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is the doubling in rental costs overall in the last 5-6 years here in town in terms of the average rental, which is absolutely shocking. The incredible rise in the rate of sale for the prices for homes, for purchases. And so all of those things do convince us that this is not business as usual, that we need to have solutions to go a lot further than the solutions we've ever had to adopt in the past. And that may require as well thinking very broadly and going out of the box on some other things as well that we haven't been dwelling upon. But we live in a world full of these tech platforms like Uber and like Airbnb. Airbnb is the one that's really applicable here. Lawyers say you can't challenge any of that. However, the reality is that that's being challenged by cities all over the place on Uber, and some are challenging the Airbnb thing. We need to look at that and get the numbers. How much is Airbnb affecting this? So we know those numbers. And if it's very severe, there are various kinds of things we can do short of banning. I'm not talking about a ban of Airbnb, but there are all kinds of things cities can do legally and constitutionally that would begin to bring some kind of control over this. Also, another big factor we see happening, not just here, but Vancouver, Seattle, and elsewhere, is more and more purchases of places by LLCs, by hidden owners who don't reveal even who they are. They're unoccupied in many places or occupied only a tiny fraction of the year. Now, I don't know to what extent that's true here in Bellingham. We don't have those numbers. Would love to have them. But there are measures that can be taken and are being taken in Toronto, in Vancouver, and I don't know in what U.S. cities, to directly address that, to tax, for instance, those kinds of purchases for those kinds of. So just want to have like a very broad kind of approach to this to make sure that we're not just building more houses that are going to be used up by these new platforms and are going to be used up and purchased by these foreign investors and other so-called investors.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, my name's Andy Douglas, and I am a PCO in Precinct 204 for the Democrats. I agree with what Andrew just said. I'm not going to repeat that. I am more focused on condominiums and duplexes, triplexes, row houses, because that's what I'm familiar with, having lived in Chicago and San Francisco and Seattle, because that's where most of the lower income people live, in those areas. I would encourage you to build those kinds of structures near parks because it makes it usable for people with children. I live in Center Point, which is surrounded by green wetlands, and that really helps the quality of life. But I do think that we need to make the condominium apartments livable for people with families, because that's where they can actually afford to buy now. And they are quite wonderful places to live if they're done well, and not just a block with no place for anybody to go. So I encourage you to think in that direction when it comes to the lower middle and lower class, the waitresses, the bartenders, the nurses' aides, the people that you actually need to keep this city running. And those people are important. We need to make sure that there's good but not necessarily single family home houses for them, because that's not going to be affordable. Also, we're experienced that whole bubble, the bursting of the bubble, and then the lack of building for a while, and then you've got a lack, and we're going through this up and down bubble pattern that is well known to human beings. So we actually need to know how many houses do we need for the city, and how many condos do we need, and that therefore we can maybe not build to the point where you burst a bubble and know where you're getting to that, but also be able to go up that high without worrying about too much. And actually, a lot of the rents will probably come down as we bring up the stocks of rental apartments available to rent. It's just a supply and demand kind of thing. When there's a true lack, the prices always go way up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. This will be continued, and meeting adjourned. Could you